In 2019, a workman walked into one of the most famous art galleries in London, raised a hammer, and began to chip a name off a wall. The name had been carved in serif capitals into pale stone, paid for by a donation in the millions. For half a century, that same name had appeared on the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, on the Louvre in Paris, on Harvard, on the Smithsonian, on Yale, on Tufts. And then, almost all at once, the museums of the world started scraping it off. The name was Sackler. The wall came down for a reason. The Sackler family, one of the richest dynasties in America, had become so toxic that the institutions they had funded could no longer afford to keep their name. Because the money behind the museum wings, the lecture halls, the medical schools was traced back to a single product, a small white time-release pill, Bankrupt Empire. The story begins in Brooklyn in the 1920s with three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler. Sons of Jewish immigrants who ran a small grocery, all three brothers paid their way through medical school during the Great Depression. They became psychiatrists. In 1952, they pooled their money and bought a struggling pharmaceutical company in Greenwich Village called Purdue Pharma. For the next 40 years, Purdue made nothing remarkable. Antiseptic, earwax remover, laxatives. It was a backwater company. The brothers were close to anonymous. But Arthur Sackler, the eldest, was doing something on the side that would change every pharmacy in the world. Arthur invented modern pharmaceutical marketing. Before him, drugs were sold to pharmacists. Arthur sold them directly to the doctors who wrote the prescriptions. He paid them speaking fees. He flew them to conferences. He bought ads in medical journals that looked indistinguishable from the journal's own articles. His masterpiece was a tranquilizer called Valium. Under Arthur's marketing, Valium became the first $100 million drug in American history. Doctors handed it out like aspirin. The blueprint was now built, and the brothers had quietly become rich. When Arthur died in 1987, his brothers bought out his estate's share of Purdue. Purdue now belonged entirely to the Mortimer and Raymond branches of the family. And one man, Raymond's son, was paying very close attention. He had grown up inside the company. He was a doctor and a board member. His name was Richard Sackler. In 1996, with Richard driving it forward, Purdue launched a new drug. It was an extended-release version of OxyContin, a powerful opioid first synthesized in Germany in 1917. They wrapped it in a brand name that sounded clean, clinical, modern: OxyContin. At the launch party for the sales force, Richard Sackler took the stage and predicted what the rollout would look like. He said, quote, "The launch of OxyContin will be followed by a blizzard of prescriptions that will bury the competition. The prescriptions will be so deep, so dense, so white." He meant a snowstorm. The metaphor would age badly, but the real product was never the pill. It was a lie. Purdue's sales reps were trained to tell American doctors that OxyContin had less than a 1% risk of addiction. Less than 1%. The proof for that claim was a single 5-sentence letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, written in 1980, that had described addiction rates in hospitalized patients on short-term morphine. Not a study, a letter. Purdue cited it in marketing materials thousands of times. They turned a paragraph into a license to print money. Armed with that lie, Purdue built one of the largest sales forces in pharmaceutical history. Hundreds of representatives fanned out across America, targeting general practitioners in small towns where there was no oversight. They were trained to push for higher doses because higher doses paid bigger commissions. They identified the doctors who wrote the most prescriptions and gave them a private nickname: the Whales. The Whales were courted, flattered, flown to resorts, and the prescription pads kept moving. The seminars were held in Boca Raton, in Scottsdale, in Hawaii. Speaking fees, golf, sponsored meals, ghost-written studies under doctors' names. By the year 2001, OxyContin was the single most prescribed brand-name narcotic in America. Purdue's annual revenue from this one drug had crossed $1 billion, and the Sacklers, once nobodies, had become one of the 20 richest families in the United States. And then the bodies began to pile up. In small mining towns across Appalachia, in rural Maine, in West Virginia, in Kentucky, in southern Ohio, prescriptions became addictions, and addictions became funerals. Pharmacies in towns of 1,000 people were dispensing tens of thousands of pills a month. Ambulances were routine. Obituaries were routine. An entire working-class generation was being chemically lost, one prescription at a time. The journalists who reported it were sued. The doctors who pushed back were ignored. The bodies kept coming. Internal Purdue emails, surfaced years later in court, would show how the family talked about the dying. Richard Sackler wrote that the company should, quote, hammer on the abusers in every way possible. The dead and dying, he wrote, are not victims. They are the culprits. They are the reckless. The problem, in the family's framing, was never the pill. The problem was the people the pill had killed. In 2007, the United States Department of Justice finally caught them. Purdue and 3 of its executives pleaded guilty to misbranding OxyContin. They admitted in writing to misleading the public about the drug's addictive potential. They paid $634 million in fines. No one went to prison. The Sackler family was not personally charged. The plea was a misdemeanor. And the very next day, Purdue went back to selling OxyContin harder than before. Over the decade that followed, the Sackler family quietly extracted more than $10 billion out of Purdue Pharma and moved much of it into private trusts, a great deal of it offshore. While they were doing this, the epidemic they had engineered kept compounding. Opioid overdose deaths in America rose past 80,000 a year, then past 100,000. The cumulative death toll from the opioid crisis, which Purdue lit the fuse on, crossed 500,000 people, 500,000 American funerals. In 2019, with thousands of lawsuits from states, cities, hospitals, and grieving families closing in, Purdue filed for bankruptcy, not because it had run out of money, because the family wanted legal protection. The settlement they negotiated would shield the Sacklers themselves from any future civil suit, in exchange for a fraction of the fortune they had pulled out. They would admit nothing. They would face nothing. They would simply walk away, and so back to the gallery, the Metropolitan Museum, the Louvre, the Tate, the Smithsonian, Harvard, Yale, Tufts, Columbia, the National Portrait Gallery. One by one, the institutions began to take down the name. The Sackler wings became unsacklered, pale rectangles on marble walls. The letters were gone. The lawsuits were settled. The family kept most of the money. And the medicine cabinets of America, in millions of houses on millions of streets, are still full of the bottles they sold. Bankrupt Empire, subscribe.